Welcome back. So let's talk about hybrid activations. So what this capability does is that it allows us to set up servers and VMs in a hybrid environment, which is very common in enterprise environments. And we can actually set up our instances, or I should say our VMs and servers that we have on-premise as managed instances reachable from AWS. So what we would do here is we can create an activation, we can give it a description, the total number of servers that we want to register. You can see the max is 1,000, but that's changeable if we go ahead and change our setting, but this will incur some costs, so keep that in mind. The next thing we do is we specify a role that allows us to create those managed instances, and we can set an activation expiry date. So if we wanted to expire activations at a certain time, we could do that to verify that no one else will activate after that point in time. And then finally, we can also specify a default instance name. So if required, we can set that. I'll leave it blank since it's optional. And then what I would do is I click Create Activation. And this gives us an activation ID. So if you look at the top, AWS provides a temporary output. It gives us an activation code, and then it gives us an activation ID. Now, how we would use these is we would install the SSM agent on our virtual machines or on-premise servers, and then we would run through the install command, which we'll look at here, and we provide that information as we're configuring our SSM agent on our hybrid instances. So if I go here and I go to manually install, this is where we can actually go through and you can see we install the RPM, we start it, etc. So this is easy because this is EC2. But how it differs is that EC2 uses roles for permission, and our on-premise hybrid would use these activation code and IDs in order to essentially authenticate with Systems Manager and say, hey, I know the secret password, so go ahead and add me to your managed instance groups, and then you can start running run commands and automations on me. So if I view the details here, you can see if we had registered instances with that ID, they would show the number here. Now I'm not going to do that because that's a little bit more in depth than this course will cover, but the documents provided do a great job of walking you through installing this agent and setting it up for hybrid environments. You can see they have a hybrid environment section here with all of the steps that are required for setting that up. So if this is something you need for your environment, be sure to check this out and walk through these steps. So let me go ahead and close that. And the next thing I want to talk about is Session Manager. So this is an awesome capability. Honestly, one of the top capabilities offered by Systems Manager. Session Manager allows us to connect to our Windows and Linux instances via an agent as opposed to RDP or SSH. So it eliminates the need for a jump server or a bastion host. So this is really cool. And it's a very big positive for security posture improvement, and a lot of security teams love using this. So for a quick start guide, I would click on Start Session. You would select the instance that you want to connect to. I would start it. And what this is doing is it's loading a connection via the agent in my console. There you go. You can see my session ID at the top, the instance we're connected to, and then I get a prompt. So now I'm in that instance within EC2 and I connected via an agent. I didn't have to SSH in. So let's go ahead and I want to curl that metadata URL that's local on instances. And you'll see that we get the instance ID right here that matches the instance ID in the console. So we verified that we're connected to that instance, and we did it using the SSM agent. So now if I go in here, I go into var log. If I list Amazon here, there's an SSM directory. So if I go into SSM, we can actually view our agent log within this directory. So let me go ahead and actually tail this log. And you can see right there, SSM session worker, and it shows our session ID right there. And then how it's connected and all of the errors that come from some of the connections. Now also to build on this, as a side note, you can see that we've also had an association come through, and it's saying that the next one will occur at this particular time. So this relates to that inventory association that we looked at previously. So let's go ahead and wrap up this. I'll terminate our session. I'll click Yep, terminate. And then let's just look at our session history. There you go. We see our unique session ID, whoever did it, so my role that I assumed, what instance it was, when it started, when it ended, and what status it's in. Now quickly, let's just look at preferences. And this is where we can edit our preferences for default sessions. So we can use the default and use the credentials of the SSM user on the instance, which is what we saw in that log. Or we can enable run as support and specify a user or role to use with a username within our operating system. We can also enable KMS encryption for our session data. So any data transmitted between us and the instance would be encrypted with a KMS key. We can write our session output to S3. Now this is why I had an error because I didn't have a bucket set up for this. But we can output log files to say, hey, who was doing what and what time were they doing it? And it could be stored in a centralized security bucket for auditing later on. We can encrypt it as well, and we can give it a prefix specific to our needs. Now the last tidbit here I want to touch on is the CloudWatch logs, and this allows us to push log data to CloudWatch in order to collect logs as if they were normal application logs, which makes sense because it's a connection like SSH, and we can log that data and either set metric filters on them or just export them for auditing and collection later on. So let me go ahead and cancel, and that'll wrap it up for Session Manager, and let's move on to Run Command. Now Run Command allows us to perform remote commands on servers with a click of a button from Systems Manager. So let's just demo this out. I click on Run a Command, and we get a list of command documents. Now we'll talk about documents later on. These are very important to understand how they work, but I already know what I want to do, so let me find this Run Shell Script document. We'll use the default version. And then what this is doing is it's running a shell script or a command on our targeted instance. So let's test this out. If I go ahead and I specify a shell script here, let me go ahead and echo a value into a temporary file, and then we'll verify that it worked. All right, so I'm just simply echoing hello Pluralsight peeps to a temporary file in temp, and it's called success. Now, if we wanted to, I could specify a working directory. So where do we want to start working from? We specify a timeout, so a 1 hour default, but you can go all the way up to 48 hours. And then we specify our targets. So we can go by tags, we can do manually, or once again, hopefully you're starting to see the pattern here, we can choose a resource group. So I could perform this command on our prod resource group and specify what kind of resource it is. Now I'm going to go ahead and do manually just so this doesn't mess up because I haven't gone back and cleaned up some of my mess. But normally you would want to do resource groups or tags based on your needs. So you might do development-based servers, then test-based servers, and then finally production. That's a general workflow. So I select my instance. I can give a comment and a timeout for the command. I can set a rate control. So I can specify either a static target or a percentage for both concurrency and error thresholds. And then we configure our output actions so we can write these to S3 for logging and tracking purposes. So that way we can view it later. Now I'm going to skip this step, but it's important to know that you can actually do this. We can also send it to CloudWatch logs. which is similar to what we just looked at. So I could specify a log group to output these log files to. I can configure our SNS notifications to give me statuses on what's going on. And then here at the bottom, they give you a CLI shortcut that you can copy and paste. Once again, this is a often overlooked thing, and it's pretty cool. So I'll click on Run, and I accidentally left this enabled. Sorry, let me go ahead and deselect that. I'll click on Run, and there we go. So now it's in progress, and what I'll do is I'll refresh, and there we go. That was pretty quick. So you can see we targeted our instance. It was successful. We see our description and parameters. And if I click on my instance here, it brings us to a details for that ID of that execution. Now there was no output because we didn't specify any, but if there were, we could see it here. So let me go back. And one last thing I want to show is, which is a new and helpful feature, is we can rerun this command or we can copy it to a new one. So these are really quick shortcuts to allow us to rerun these commands on demand. It used to be where you'd have to go back in and start a new run command and go through the entire process each time you wanted to run it. Now let's just verify that worked. I'm going to go back to Session Manager and let's start a session on that instance and let's verify that it actually worked and created that temporary file. So I'm logged in once again with my session, and if I go to temp and I list, there it is, success. So if I cat success, hello Pluralsight peeps, there you go. It created that file that we worked with using that run command from within Systems Manager itself. We did not even have to interact with the operating system at all. We just utilized the Amazon SSM agent that was installed on this instance. So that's another good stopping point. We've covered hybrid activations at a high level. We talked about Session Manager and its uses, and we just looked at run commands, which allow us to execute commands on instances utilizing the agent as opposed to having to connect via SSH or RDP. So let's go ahead and wrap this clip up. And in the final clip of this capabilities section, we'll look at State Manager, Patch Manager, and Distributor.